Now, during this period, one of the things that the Muslims were noted for was their tolerance of other religions. And this is obviously because the Prophet ﷺ taught us about the Dhimma system. And I want to say a few words, because the Dhimma system is considered very negatively now in the modern world of global community, what they call the global community, where everybody cares about everybody else and nobody steals from anybody else's wealth or property. I mean, I'll give you an example of Dhimmatun. Now, in the Gulf War I, right, the United States protected Kuwait, and it was a good thing because Kuwait was unjustly, but it wasn't for free. It cost a lot of money, really, like several hundred, tens of billions of dollars. So it costed a lot of money, and the Kuwaiti government paid quite dearly for that protection. So things aren't free. Protection's not free. I mean, that's just the way the world works. So you can call it paying for our weapons or whatever you want to call it, but in Islam, it's just dhimma means responsibility. It's much cheaper than America charges for protection. I guarantee you, it's a much better deal. And it's all out in the open. It's just there, right in the open. Just sign on the dotted line, enter into an agreement, and we'll protect you. You don't have to do anything. And what's amazing, the justice of the Muslims is that when the Muslims retreated from certain areas in Syria, because they were unable to protect the Christians and Jews of that area, they actually returned their money to them. And this is documented historically. So they weren't squeezing people out. And we even know that Sayyidina Umar said, if they can't pay it, don't force it from them. In other words, it was pay if you're able to, if you have that capacity. There were old people that could no longer pay the dhimma, and Sayyidina Umar would excuse them from that. So dhimmatun was not a negative thing. In fact, some وَهُمْ صَاغِرُونَ حَتَّى يَدْفَعُوا الْجِزْيَةَ عَنْ يَدٍّ وَهُمْ صَاغِرُونَ, which is in the Quran. There's a big debate about what صَاغِر means. And I really find it dangerous to say in a state of humiliation, which is how many of the tafsirs say it. Saghir is also something, it's somebody who's under somebody else. So we could look at it as a minority. They pay with their hands because they're a minority. They're in a weakened position. And dhimma means responsibility. Whose dhimma are they in? They're in the dhimma of Allah and His Messenger. Fi dhimmati Allahi wa rasulihi. And that's your responsibility, the Muslims, to protect and defend their mosques, their synagogues, their churches. And according to the Maliki and Hanafi schools that were operative in the majority of the Islamic lands, also the Buddhist temples, the Hindu temples, because the Shafi'is restrict it to the three major Ahlul Kitab, Jews, Christians, and then the Majus. But the Malikis and Hanafis extended it to anybody who was willing to enter into a covenant with the Muslims. And in fact, one of my teachers, Sheikh Sadiq al-Ghirayani, includes in his Mudawwana al-Jadida, which is a book he wrote on Maliki fiqh, he includes secularists, that they would also enter into that covenant to be protected. And the Prophet said, "Man adali dhimmiyan fa ana khasmuhu yawm al-qiyamah." Whoever harms a dhimmi, a Jew, a Christian, or anybody else in a covenant with the Muslims, whoever harms them, I will be the advocate of that dhimmi on the Day of Judgment. The Prophet will be the advocate of that dhimmi. Now, one of the fantasies that many Muslims have about Muslim history is that when the Muslims came, everybody just said, Allahu Akbar, La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah, we're Muslims. That's the fantasy that Muslims have. In fact, Imam Zayd once remarked that when you read Islamic history, you have to take a double dose of Iman vitamins, because it can be actually quite disturbing to see some of the things that occurred in Muslim history. Now, according to Dr. Khalid Blankenship, who I regard as probably one of the greatest living historians, that's my own personal opinion, but he's the Ibn Khaldun of his time. Dr. Khalid Blankenship said that in Egypt, it took 300 years before the Muslims reached 50% of the population. In Syria, it took 500 years. So during all of that early period, the majority of people in those countries were not Muslims. And if you read in the history, and just one example of this, because it's very important in relation to Andalusia. One example of this is the extraordinary scholar Tajuddin as-Subki, who wrote a really beautiful book, Mu'id al-Ni'am wa Mubid al-Niqam, how to maintain blessings and how to avoid calamities. In that book, he mentions that he wished the Muslims would leave all their disputations and arguing amongst each other and reach out to all of the non-Muslims in the community. He said, we use these people, nastaghilluhum. I mean, he's living in the 8th century. Nastaghilluhum, he said, we exploit them. Nastatibbuhum, we go to them for medicine. And he said, wa nastakhdimuhum, nattakhiduhum khadama, we take them as servants, but we don't teach them what Islam is. We don't tell them about Islam. So he was complaining at that time, and he mentions that they were all over. There were so many of them. So as late as that, there were many, many non-Muslims. But over the years and over the centuries, many of these people ended up becoming Muslim. But we are still, and I'm proud of the fact that there are several million Coptic Christians in Egypt. Really, I think it's a source of pride. It's not a source of failure for the Muslims. It's a source of pride that their churches were protected in a time when the Europeans were literally banishing from their land anything that had to do not only with other religions, but with Christian doctrines that did not accord with their own. So the Catholics were expelling Unitarians. And when the Protestants emerged, the Catholics persecuted them mercilessly. Many of the great Protestants, actually, who were in Eastern Europe, ended up moving to the Ottoman lands because the Ottomans didn't care if they were Protestant or Catholic. They just said, you're welcome to come. And they let them come. So it's very important to see that as a source of pride, that the Muslims defended their minority.